Гарри, добрый вечер.
Good evening, Gary. Hello.
Вот я посмотрел сейчас, мы с вами
I just
беседовали
looked it up
крайний раз
and I
2
figured that
месяца
we
назад.
spoke last two,
И
three
как
months
все
ago.
изменилось за это время.
So many
2
things
месяца назад.
have changed.
Да.
2 months ago.
Такое ощущение, что это
Really?
было целую вечность.
It seems it was
А
whole
прошла вечность, вы
eternity
видите, и сколько в эту
back.
вечность уместилось
And imagine
событий,
how many events
несопоставимых с пониманием
happened
вообще. Скажите,
over
пожалуйста,
this time,
что
and we can't
происходит?
even comprehend that. Could you tell us
Вот
what's
я
going
сейчас
on?
вспоминаю, когда вот вы говорите про вечность,
When you
и
say
столько событий
eternity
вмещается.
and
Мы в книжках читали,
the
да, что на
number of
войне год
events,
за 3.
we used to
Да.
Но
read
это
in
было
the
на той
books that
войне, на
1
тех старых
year
войнах.
went
Я
for
думаю, сейчас
3,
просто
but it was
тут
back
буквально
then with
там
those
неделя за
old
год
wars. But I
идет
think
просто. То
today
есть,
1
потому
week
что
goes for a
события
year.
спрессовываются.
The
И
events
мне
are
кажется,
compressed.
что есть фактор, который нам
And I
еще
think that there is
предстоит
this factor
оценить.
that we'll
Это,
have to
наверное, первая
evaluate in
война,
the
которую
future.
мы
I think this
буквально
is the
видим,
first
вот,
war
если
that
не в
we
прямом эфире,
see
то
online, we
события
see
приходят
in
там
real
на наши
time.
мобильные там телефоны,
We get the
буквально с
news on our
интервалом
mobile
там, я
phones
не знаю, в часы, если не в минуты.
with a very short delay, maybe minutes or
И мы все
hours.
видим, и
And we
боевые
can see
действия,
everything. We can see combat
преступления,
operations.
жуткие
We
преступления
can see
совершенно.
horrible war
Одно дело
crimes.
говорить там про вот страшные преступления прошлого.
One thing we
Мы
speak
помним,
about
как
horrible crimes of the
немцы
past.
всегда как бы утверждали, что ну, мы,
Germans
конечно,
used to say,
догадывались, что что-то было, но
oh
мы не
yes,
видели, что было
we
в Освенциме и Бухенвальде.
guessed
А
what
вот
was
сейчас
going
мы
on,
имеем
but we
дело
didn't
с
see what
совершенно
was there
невероятным
in Buchenwald or Auschwitz.
феноменом
But today we
такого
have this
отрицания
amazing
того, что
phenomenon
люди все знают уже. Уже
that
это бессмысленно
people
как бы
deny
говорить
what
о том, что
everybody knows.
ну, это надо еще выяснить, все. Ну,
Kind
ясно
of
совершенно,
saying,
что
so
все
we need to
разговоры о
clarify
фейках, там,
things, it's not quite
российской власти
obvious.
преступной,
And
они
again, all this
никого
fake
не
information
убеждают.
that
Мне кажется,
Russia
они сами как бы, то есть,
is
говорят уже
distributing and
по
probably
инерции.
don't even
Вот,
believe
но вот
in that
возвращаясь к вопросу
information
о
itself.
психологическом эффекте, о травме,
And
я
when we go
думаю,
back to this question of
это очень
trauma
серьезный
and
вызов вообще
psychological
всему
effect,
человечеству,
I would say this is a
прогрессивному
great
человечеству. На самом деле
challenge
людям,
for all humanity,
которые
to
считали,
all
что, вы знаете,
progressive people.
вот 21 век, что все это осталось в
Because we
прошлом,
kind of think,
что там
it's
это
21st
зло, оно
century,
такое
all
даже
evil is in the
карикатурное, это
past,
там для
and even
там
this
«Властелина
evil, it's kind
колец»
of
там, или
caricature
там,
evil,
или
and
каких-то
it's more
других там
for
фильмов,
some
книг.
movies and
Ну,
books
здесь такого же
and
не может быть. Ну
Lord
да,
of the
конечно, это
Rings.
случалось в Руанде, и, конечно, где-то
And
сейчас
yes, of course, it
происходит,
happened in
не в
Rwanda and
Европе же.
somewhere else, but not in Europe.
И вдруг
And
выясняется, на
then,
самом деле, что вся
all of a
технология, весь
sudden, it
прогресс
turns out that
технологический,
technology,
он на самом деле, в общем,
progress,
оказал минимальное
had a
влияние
minimum
на
impact
прогресс
on
человека.
human
Ну,
progress.
понятно, что как бы где-то эти процессы идут
Clearly,
параллельно,
somewhere
а
these
где-то они оказались
processes
просто абсолютно
were
как бы
going in
идут
parallel, but in some areas,
в разных
it
измерениях.
turned out they were in different dimensions.
То есть дать человеку iPhone, там, Android,
You give someone an
научить его
iPhone or an
обращаться со
Android,
современной техникой,
you teach them how to
раскрыть ему
use
глаза на
modern
весь мир, когда
technology,
он может знать все,
they
что
can
происходит в мире.
see
На
what's
самом
going on
деле
in the
это
world,
никоим образом не
but in fact,
останавливает преступления.
it doesn't
Более того,
stop
иногда даже как-то
crimes, and
способствует,
sometimes
потому что мы
it
видим
even
случаи,
contributes
когда
to
российские офицеры и
crimes. When
солдаты
we see
просто
Russian
гордятся
officers and
буквально
soldiers,
тем, что
they
они
are
делают,
proud of what they're
преступлениями,
doing,
и
committing
делятся
those
этими
crimes, and
кадрами.
they're sharing
Естественно, конечно,
that
помогают
footage
правосудию в итоге,
with
сами
others,
того
and
не
somehow
понимая.
they're actually
Но вот,
helping
вот этот разговор
justice
обезьяна с
in the
гранатой, на
future.
самом деле,
So,
он
and this
буквально вот
image
сейчас
of
как-то вот в
monkey
этой
within a
войне
grenade
ужасный, он просто
at this
приобретает
point
уже
is
такое
taking
более,
shape,
как бы конкретное очертание.
more solid shape.
Вот, и я не сомневаюсь, что украинская война,
I have no doubt that
она
Ukrainian
является
war
такой вот реперной точкой в истории.
will be a benchmark in the
Это не
history.
просто война, которая, я не сомневаюсь, кончится победой Украины
It's
и
not
восстановлением территориальной
just
целостности.
a war
Это война, которая подводит на
that's
самом
happening.
деле
I'm sure
итог
it will
вообще какому-то периоду развития человечества. Вот на самом деле вот такое
it will end with the victory of
междувремение было
Ukraine.
между окончанием
In
холодной
some way,
войны
this
и
war
между
is summing up
украинской войной.
what was happening between the
Вот. И
Cold War and
сейчас
the
мы
Ukrainian war.
расплачиваемся за нежелание
And
понимать, что
now
вообще-то
we're
зло
paying the
никуда не уходит.
price
Вот,
for
вот это
not
вот тот
understanding
самый
that evil
парадокс,
did
как говорится,
not
что человеческая
go
природа,
anywhere.
она меняется гораздо медленнее, а зачастую вообще не меняется
And we
с
have to say that
технологическим
human
прогрессом.
nature
Вот. И
doesn't
сейчас,
change
когда
or
вот
changes
мы
very
там
little
слышим там разговоры, там,
with
вот,
progress.
все-таки как же такое могло быть?
And
Знаете,
when we
вот
hear
в
all these
России
talks
все-таки
about,
русская
how it
культура,
could
ну дальше там
happen,
список
Russia
аргументов
with this
традиционно
level of
приводится.
culture and the whole list
Все
of
это мы слышали
arguments.
80 лет назад.
So we've heard the same thing
Германия,
80 years ago with Germany. They were saying, how is it possible in the country of Hegel, Kant,
Ответ может, на самом
and
деле.
Beethoven?
И это могло
Yes,
случиться не
it
только
can.
в в 30-е годы 20 века.
And it could happen not
Это
only in
происходит вот сейчас на
1930s,
наших
it's
глазах.
happening right
И это
now
заставит нас,
in
мне
front
кажется,
of us.
переосмысливать вообще вот всю
And this
систему отношений
makes
вообще вот,
us
между
rethink the whole
государством, между
system
людьми вообще.
of relations
Понять, как
between
вообще
the
надо
states
вот,
and people.
выстраивать инфраструктуру не
We
только
need to think about
экономическую, не только
how we
финансовую,
will
но
build
и вот эту социальную,
infrastructure, not only
политическую, вот, как
economic
бы,
or financial, but
отношения
also social,
межличностную,
political, and
вот,
also
с учетом
interpersonal
трагического
relations,
опыта, который
taking
мы
into
сейчас
account that tragic
получаем в
experience
результате вот
that
этой
we're
страшной войны.
getting as a
Вы
result of this
могли себе
war.
представить, что такое вообще возможно?
Could you imagine that it was possible?
Войну мог
I
представить себе,
could imagine the
много
war,
раз об этом говорил. То есть
and I
для
spoke
меня
about it many times.
нападение Путина на Украину
For me,
было как бы
Putin's attack
делом
on Ukraine,
предрешенным.
it was a
Но
predetermined
даже
business.
я, в данном случае я не говорю не сейчас, а я говорил об этом много
It's
много
not like
лет.
I'm saying
То есть
it
в данном
now. I
случае
spoke
мне было
about it
совершенно
many years
очевидно,
ago.
что
To me, it was
Путин не
obvious
остановится на достигнутом ровно потому, что
that
ему все
Putin
сошло с рук.
will not stop
Диктатор
with this
никогда не
because he
останавливается,
actually
пока
got
его не
away with other
останавливают.
things.
Правило истории.
Dictators never
И Путин
stop.
здесь не
They are
исключение.
stopped. And Putin is
Безнаказанность,
not
которая сопровождала все его
an
преступления,
exception.
начиная с Второй Чеченской войны
His impunity that accompanied all his crimes, starting with the Second Chechen War and the Crimea and bombing Aleppo and many other things, the whole list of his crimes.
Вот эта безнаказанность,
This
она
impunity
убеждала меня в том, что он рано
convinced
или
me
поздно
that sooner or
попробует
later
решить украинский вопрос
he will
кардинально.
decide to settle
Не то, что
Ukrainian
у меня,
matter
как говорится,
once
мысль
and for
крутила
all.
в голове, я просто слушал
It's
то, что
not
говорил
like
сам
this
Путин, и говорил его
thought just
пропаганда.
popped up in my head. I'm
Для
just listening to
Путина
what Putin is
Украина
saying.
была тем же, что Польша для Сталина.
For Putin,
Это
Ukraine is
вот,
the same as Poland for
такое
Stalin.
недоразумение на политической
It's
карте,
like a
которое надо
misfit on the
ликвидировать для
political
того,
map
чтобы реализовывать
that
свои
should be
геополитические планы.
destroyed
И
to realize
то, что
his
последние 8 лет
geopolitical
российская
plans.
пропаганда
And what
вдалбливала
Russian
мысль,
propaganda is
вот эту
doing
мысль,
over 8
усиливающую
years
мысль
and is
в
hammering this
мозги подведомственного
simple
населения,
thought
о том, что Украина
into
вне до государства,
Russian
что
people's
ее надо
mind that
расчленить,
Ukraine
разделить.
is not really a
Вообще это один
state
народ,
and
и
it should
вообще
be
пора восстановить историческую
destroyed because,
справедливость.
we're one
То
people
есть
and we
это
have to
всё было
restore
той самой
historical justice and all that.
к
So
нападению.
all this was a preparation for
Но
the attack,
представить себе масштаб вот
for the
этого
invasion. But to imagine the
злодеяния
scale
даже
of
мне
this
было
villainy,
трудно. Меня тоже
it was
сдерживали
hard
вот эти
even for me.
стереотипы 21
And I
века.
also was
И
held
вот,
back
ну, вы
by the
понимаете, да,
stereotypes
конечно,
of the
они
21st
нападут,
century. Of course, they may
но
attack,
вот та же ошибка.
but again, the
Я
same
всегда
mistake.
говорил, что у Путина нет аллергии на кровь.
I used to say
Что
that Putin doesn't have allergy to blood.
у него как бы такой, ну, как бы вот criminal record. У него, в принципе,
He has his
есть
criminal record
кредитная история.
or
Вот.
his credit history.
Вот даже я допускал ту же ошибку, считая, что
even
человек,
I
который отдал
made this
приказы
mistake.
бомбить сирийские города,
The person
терять с
who
лица земли,
made an order
он
to
остановится
destroy
перед
Syrian
бомбежкой
cities,
Харькова.
I thought
Вот
he
это, даже у меня была психологическая ошибка.
wouldn't bomb Kharkov.
Вот
I had
прекрасно
the
мы это всё
psychological
поняли. На
mistake.
самом
Now we
деле,
understand the whole
мир
thing.
стал гораздо меньше.
The world became smaller,
Буквально стал меньше, потому что
literally,
события, которые происходят в разных точках планеты, нам известны.
because events
Мы
that
всё
are
знаем
happening
про Сирию.
in different parts of the
И
planet we know.
как бы, когда мы видим там генерала Дворникова,
And when we see
которого
General
назначают там
Dvornikov, who
командующим
is
операцией,
appointed
мы
to be
понимаем, что как бы,
commander-in-chief of this military
это
operation,
уже финальная стадия. То есть
so we understand that this is the final stage.
Последняя, как говорится, последняя карта Путина не
The
могу взять,
last
все разрушить.
card of
Всё,
Putin,
всё
if I can't
сорвать
grab
с
it,
лица земли, да еще,
I will destroy it.
учитывая тоже кредитную историю Дворникова,
And
можно
also
химическим
given what
оружием
Dvornikov
То есть,
did
на самом деле, в
in his
общем-то, вот
lifetime,
сейчас как бы стало
so he
очевидно,
can even play with
что
chemical
нет
weapons.
разницы, там, Сирия, Африка,
So for them there is
Украина
no
в этом
difference.
плане.
Syria,
Это не
Africa,
вопрос
Ukraine,
где, это
it's
вопрос
not a
кто.
question where, it's a question
И
whom.
Путин никакой разницы между
And
Алеппо
Putin
и Харьковом
doesn't
не
see
видит.
any difference between Kharkov and
Что
Aleppo.
меня, конечно, ну я не скажу поразило, но все равно
What
не
actually
перестаю удивляться,
not really
что Путин
shocked
эту
me,
разницу не видит.
but surprised me.
А те,
Putin
кто
doesn't see this
бомбят,
difference. But what
Особенно,
about
как мы
those who
знаем, у
bomb?
некоторых вообще родственники в Украине.
Especially
Мамы,
those who have family
они
in
тоже-
Ukraine.
Вот здесь, конечно,
at
здесь
this point, of
наступает
course,
уже такой легкий ступор. Я пытаюсь
I'm
призвать
hitting
на помощь
a
как бы
concrete
исторический
wall.
опыт,
I
который
just
из книг почерпнутый.
Can't imagine that. I'm like
Думаю,
trying
в
to
Германии
draw this
был,
historical experience, what I read in the
12
books,
лет был Гитлер у
and I'm
власти.
thinking,
Они
so
до
Hitler
45-го
was in
года
power for 12
сопротивлялись,
years,
хотя все было понятно, что когда
and they
война
were
безнадежно
fighting
проиграна.
till the very
Здесь
end in
22
1945, and they
года.
knew
Ну,
it's
всё-таки,
futile.
ну,
But
какие-то
here
же
it's
должны быть ограничители.
22
Вот как-то
years,
вот
but there should be
какие-то
some
должны
stoppers
были.
for
Там
them.
Ведь
Germans, they had this horrible criminal idea of domination of Aryan race. And it was a horrible plan. But here there is no plan at all. It's just pure destruction. Uniqueness of Putin's regime is, and difference of it from the great criminals of the past, those ones, they had these global ideas, horrible ideas. Stalin had an idea, but this one doesn't have anything, just destruction. I can't grab it, I'll destroy it.
Это что-то связанное вот с такой переплавкой
It has something to do with
как бы криминальных наклонностей.
Mixing up the criminal proclivities, and we need to find these roots of it in Putin's childhood, in his life in back streets of St. Petersburg. Criminal environment, also KGB criminal organization, Dresden when he worked with Stasi, criminal St. Petersburg, and all that was mixed up with absolute power that was growing for him. And for him, the world is simple. It's like, I can't buy it for money, I can buy it for big money. So I can buy Chancellor of Germany or Prime Minister of France. And I want to be ruler of the world. So now this idea is taking shape. And as the result of it, we get Führer, leader, or mob boss that rules the country, that is involved in this cult of impunity. In Russia, they didn't really value humans' life. And what happened in Russia was an indicator where the whole thing is going. You know, when in 2005 our dissenters marches started, and we used to discuss the arrangements with the police, so how we're going to get the approvals and all that. And then gradually the whole thing changed. And in 2012, when I was arrested at the court building where the Pussy Riot Band trial was held, I realized that those special police forces that are beating people up and arresting them, so they kind of crossed that line from humans to inhumans. So it was happening in Russia, but we knew that sooner or later there's this cult of impunity of the power over people, and he will spread it to other countries. And that's why now, when I am spelling it out here during this talk, they knew they could do it in Russia, now they know they can do it in Ukraine or in any other country where they will be allowed to go to. Because they don't see any problem with that. For them, it's even easier because it's a foreign country, they're sent there, and they'll do what they do the best, kill, beat, and rape. So we have this group of people that kind of passed this line between humans and inhumans. How long haven't you been in Russia? I left Russia at the end of February of 2013, so almost 9 years. Here's my question. I look at these Russian soldiers that come to us on these rusty tanks. You know, generals, they kind of sold their army, stole the money. Army is absolutely unequipped, and even those bulletproof vests have cardboard inserts. So these young soldiers come to us, and I listen to their radio intercepts. They speak this horrible, obscene language to their mothers, to their fathers, and they hear the same and respond. The same with their wives. Their wives, they allow them to rape other women in Ukraine and just tell them, you know, just use contraceptives. And their wives, they tell them what they need to looked for in those houses they attack. And I look at these pointless killings and rapings. They rape infants. We already know the names of those who did that, let alone about those mass rapings of women and girls. I realize that Russia turned into this horrible country where everybody rapes everybody. We saw this footage from prisons where men rape men. So what happened to this country? What kind of disrupted DNA this is? So how far in the history you want to go? Shall we limit ourselves with the last 100 years? Yes, let's do that. Frankly, we are dealing here with a negative selection. It's a unique experiment that they started in 1917. What was before we can discuss. Nevertheless, it's clear that Russia had future. It wasn't perfect, but nevertheless, that country had future. It had potential economic, demographical, social. Yes, it was not a perfect democracy, but in September of 1917, for a short time, Russia became a republic, and the elections for Constituent Assembly were the most democratic ones. I mean, the principles they used for these elections, Bolsheviks, they dissolved it, but really, the election was done according to all the democratic principles: general, free, direct, equal, and secret. So all components there. And then Bolsheviks' time starts. And now we understand that this horror that has to do with Bolsheviks' terror, it was happening with different intensity, but actually left a horrible scar on the country. But then the war, the Second World War, and the best people die in the wars. Anything happens, but nevertheless, you know, those who were the best and the toughest ones were rising in the attack. Well, and before that, there was the Great Famine. Yes, right, but you know, everything. In fact, there were famines. You know, there was one great famine and then the minor ones. But you know, minor is not a proper word, but nevertheless, it's clear there was a constant war with its own people. And there were so many people left. Yes, philosopher's ship, you know, with those intellectuals that were sent away from the country, and destruction of gene pool of the nation. The potential was huge in the country, and just imagine what it was if the country, despite all these atrocities, was still functioning. And now we see this. Then, obviously, the prison guards, they managed to survive in more numbers than prisoners. So, and naturally, when we're in more vegetarian period, post-Stalin period, also dictatorship, horrible things in camps, but there was not this mass terror. But by then, the country was extremely sick, maybe even incurably sick. And there was this chance in 1991. The country had this intellectual potential still. The Soviet Union collapsed. It was a good thing. But Russia didn't use that. It missed it. Because the benchmarks they chose were wrong benchmarks. But the main thing is Russia did not reject its imperial core and did not transform into a national state. National state can be anything. You know, different people live in one country with different ethnicities, but they have common history, common language, and common culture. It's a national state. But Russia remained an empire, and all these imperial complexes, they still remain. They didn't go anywhere. And the same happened with the separation of Abkhazia from Georgia, Prидnestrovia and Moldova, but they didn't touch Ukraine. But we understand they had a grudge. And Lushkov off in the middle of the 90s. He was saying that Sevastopol and the Crimea should be Russians. And then the Second Chechen War, and they already had those atrocities during those wars that was spread across other places, and with tens of thousands of killed Chechens. Well, actually, there was an Afghan war that 1 million people died there, and let alone Berlin 1953, Budapest 1956, and Prague 1968. All these things are links of the same sequence. In other words, the chance for transformation was lost, and the rise of oil prices helped people to receive Putin as a savior. And the Chechen War and explosions of the buildings in Moscow, and I'm sure that there is engagement of KGB in that, it created a certain image in people's mind, and it's very hard to fight that image. Obviously, you can't really shift your responsibility on others, but we have to say this thing. The West gave Putin kind of a free ride to do whatever he wants. They were helping him, dealing with him. And for us it was hard, how to actually get to Russians. Myself and Boris Nemtsov, we kept saying that Putin will be a problem for everybody. Nobody heard us. What can you say when Putin was hosting G8? But I used to say that it's not G8, it's G7 plus 1. And he was hosting all leaders of the free world. And how can you explain to your supporter that Putin is not representing democratic Russia? Kasparov said that other people say, but look, we have Bush, Merkel, Sarkozy here, and Putin is welcoming them. Yes, maybe we don't have a perfect democracy, but obviously everything is going according to the plan. And when Medvedev shows up, this dwarf, whom they put on the throne to warm it up for Putin, and we understand what it was. And he is a dwarf in all senses of this word. But we need to give credit to Putin. He found a person who will give him this absolute power back. See, we need to admit that he is able to identify people, to figure people out. Because, the president of Russia could actually fire the prime minister, whom Putin was, but he actually found a person who will give him the power back on the silver platter. And all this Medvedev's incantations when he was saying freedom is better than no freedom, and all this verbal garbage that he was saying, and somehow it impressed the West. And they thought that they were trying to improve their relationship with Russia, and we were trying to tell them, so Putin is still there, and he's still pulling the strings, and the West didn't hear us. So in other words, it's their readiness to put up with the evil. And Condoleezza Rice actually said that, when she said that Lukashenko is the last dictator of Europe, but it wasn't the Soviet Union. And this talk was back then in 2006 and 2007, so that wasn't the Soviet Union. It's even worse, and potentially worse, because this is a system, criminal system, that is integrated into Western world, and if it gains power, it's going to be much more serious, because the Soviet Union was in some ways restricted with ideology. Here there are no any restrictions. It's mafia, fascists, communists, whatever, anything to spread it. It's like cancerous tumor that they're spreading. And I think Condoleezza Rice thought, yes, well, they are thieves, but they're not going to do anything that's going to undermine the business that we have. And even the Crimea's annexation wasn't an alarm for them. Well, Georgia, see, with Georgia war, they didn't have annexation there. You need to understand that all actions of Putin and Yeltsin before him, they never went so far as annexation. Clearly, Abkhazia and Ossetia, they were separated from Georgia, but there was no annexation. Annexation is a line, it's crossing that red line. After the Second World War, there were two annexations, Tibet, China, and Tibet has a special status, and Saddam Hussein with Kuwait. Even Turkey didn't annex the northern Cyprus, understanding what annexation is. And Putin decided to step over this red line, and what happened? Nothing happened. Somehow it just worked out. And I think at that point Putin decided for himself that liquidation of Ukraine as a state is a matter of time. So since they let me annex Crimea, and there was this war in the east of Ukraine, well, it didn't quite work out, but, my plans didn't quite realize. So let's try to do it through Minsk format. He was looking for ways to do it bloodlessly, so to speak, without mass violence. And he was trying to incorporate this cancerous tumor into Ukraine. So then it didn't happen, and he started getting ready for the war. This is the logic of any dictator from the past. If I can do this and I can get away with this, why not to do that? See, it's interesting that the West imposed unprecedented sanctions on Russia, and nobody was expecting such a package of sanctions. But nevertheless, every day Russia gets $1 billion from selling gas and oil. There are two things that can actually save Ukraine. This is oil embargo on Russian oil and shipments of offensive lethal weapons from the West. Is the West ready to do that? Let's analyze the behavior of the West and where Putin made a mistake. In fact, Putin assessed actions of the West very correctly. In the situation when Ukraine could be destroyed within 4 or 5 days, he had no doubt, and I think he had reasons for that. To think that the West would want to negotiate. In some way, the whole thing, if I may say so, looked for Putin kosher. Parade on the main street, they bring Yanukovych or some other guy to be president of Ukraine. Zelensky runs away, kind of sits in Warsaw, writing his statements. We call up Joe Biden, we say, hey, so we divide the country, and the Americans say, well, what to do? There is nothing to be done. Here's the situation. Yes, it's bad. But yes, of course, we will punish you with sanctions, but it's new political reality, so we're not going to spill blood. That's why first 3-4 days they were not bombing civilians. It was clear that the goal was to free Ukraine, quote-unquote. There were no incidents. It will start later when Blitzkrieg fails. What changed the situation? Resistance of the Ukrainian army. In fact, this is something that dictators don't really understand. And what's surprising that the free world didn't get it either. That free people, they fight and resist differently. There are certain things that you can't really calculate on the paper. And all these American experts, Pentagon and CIA, they failed drastically. Because now we know that Pentagon and CIA experts, they were convincing Biden that it will take a few days for this war. You can criticize Biden, but he was trusting his experts. And when, CIA director tells you, so it's 3-4 days, and General Milley tells you, so we're going to be getting ready for guerrilla war, like in Afghanistan and Vietnam, so we will be just shipping them weapons for this war, so they're not going to win this one. And this theory was dominating. That's why Putin had 3 meetings with Biden. June of the last year, personal summit in Geneva with Biden, and then 2 long talks, conference talks. And as a result of these three talks, Putin realized that nothing will happen. He's a very good psychologist. He was listening to Biden, he was getting information from negotiations between Blinken and Lavrov and other officials on both sides. He knew that he can get away with this. And Europe, it's just funny, Germany, France, Baltic countries, they were just scared. So he built this plan around this, on what was before. But at the point when it was clear that Blitzkrieg failed and Kyiv started resisting, and when Zelensky said, "I don't need a ride, I need ammunition," this historical phrase, the whole thing changed because public opinion in the West drastically changed. And it changed not only in the United States, it changed in Germany too. And I think it's a very important point. You see, that German trauma that they had for almost 8 years after 1945, it was still fresh. And what Putin did, he did not really erase it, but he helped to heal it. The Germans saw fascism, but on the other side, yes, for them it took a while to kind of get rolling, but they went on with sanctions. Germany changed its position. The Nord Stream was closed on the next day, and of course Putin did not expect that, because they were doing business for so many years. And then it turns out that public opinion changes things. That's why for today we have the situation when the West is moving slowly, but moving. The thing that they didn't declare no-fly zone, and they were not shipping the necessary weapons. But that's on the conscience of their leaders. Public opinion wanted it, but only now Western generals and their special forces experts, they know that Ukraine can win the war, and we see how the situation changes. So now the question of shipping the modern weapons to Ukraine, it's a matter of time, not principle. So there are, talking about embargo, there are some electoral laws. So, and politicians in the West, they need to weigh it. We don't know who's going to win in France. And with all dissatisfaction with Macron's actions, with his ambiguous position, but our choice is between Macron and actually Putin's agent. We have to understand that Putin's propaganda in the West succeeded very much. And the money they invested in the West, they were spent more properly than in Ukraine. So they stole less than they stole in Ukraine. In Germany, I understand the things changed. But in France, the presidential elections, 3 pro-Putin candidates together, they got 52%. So of course it's not going to automatically transform into Le Pen's votes, but it actually shows you how fragile everything is in the West. That's why right now I would be expecting gas and oil embargo. First probably will be oil embargo, and Europe can do this. But we need to do this. We need to demand as much as we can, and we get what helps us to improve the situation today. There is also a very important factor when we're talking about sanctions. This is prolongations of them. In fact, how serious the West is that the sanctions will sustain, until what point. Therefore, we crossed another line here. What Biden said about a criminal regime and then genocide, even with all the reservations of his administration, it means that there won't be any normalization of relations while Putin is in power. So, and it means that there will be rearrangement of all gas shipments. So right now they are laying foundation of new relationships in the future. And I think it's extremely important. What's important is not how soon they will declare embargo on Russian gas, but what's important is this. It's going to be a turning point. They have to say, our goal in this war is Ukrainian victory and restoration of its territorial integrity. And sanctions will not be lifted until Russia leaves Ukraine and pays all reparations for all crimes, and all the war criminals would be put on trial. When they say this, then it will be countdown for Putin regimes, for Putin personally, and for his cronies. Okay, personally for Putin. Let's try to get under his skin, if we can actually call this man a man. Is he a fascist for you? I have a problem with the word fascist. Sadly, there is some words like Nazi, fascist. We devalue these words. Who he is for you? He's a criminal. There was this book about Hitler in USSR. It was called Criminal Number One. He's criminal number one. I always said that Putin is an existential threat to our world in 21st century. Putin is a man of the long foregone past. He sees the world absolutely differently. For him, violence, it's not a possible thing. It's a desirable element of running his country and spreading his influence. Some equivalents of Putin. This is Stalin and Ivan the Terrible. This is an ideal of a ruler who is above the law. It's not even a monarchy, it's even more than that. It's like, I do whatever I want. It's an idea of an absolute power that is not restricted with anything. And these images of the past that he's trying to implement in these crimes in Ukraine, this is a real threat not only for Ukraine and for those who are killed, raped, and beaten. This is a challenge for the whole world. And as I told you, the psychological trauma. We are looking at this, and he says, I have this nuclear bomb and I can throw it. Can he? I think these fears are exaggerated. First of all, he can't do it himself. He has to make an order to push the button. And I think there are some number of buttons that should be pushed on the way. And here, this is what's important. The relationships within this criminal system. For example, he decided it's time for everybody to die. But are you sure that generals and admirals, they share this idea? But what about tactical nuclear weapons? No matter how scary it sounds, this does not resolve any military issues they have. For example, they can throw the bomb on Kharkov or Kiev. Again, tactical nuclear weapons. Who will push the button? Oh, there are lots of wackos there who can do that. Wait a second, it's an important point. Yes, there are many wackos there. But, wackos who want to kill 1,000 to 10,000 people, he has enough of them. But does he have enough of those wackos who want to kill people and to be killed at the same time? Oh, I'm sure that he has that. But, I'm not sure about admirals and generals that can do that. But listen, look at Dvornikov's face. Look at those faces. Well, Dvornikov's face shows you his criminal proclivities. It doesn't tell you anything about his readiness to die for the right to kill the others. Ukrainian guys were demonstrating their readiness to die on the island, on the Snake Island. But those guys who are bombing Ukrainian maternity hospitals, I'm not sure that they will be just as active when they see NATO jet fighters. Yes, they can push the button and kill people, but if they know when NATO says so that any Russian military unit that uses weapons of mass destruction will be immediately destroyed, I think even General Dvornikov will cool down. Because see what happened to the cruiser Moscow, it's pretty indicative, you know, and it's not just a flagship that they sank. What's important that there is no impunity anymore. You know, why they missed the missile? Probably it wasn't the newest missile that was shot at them. And besides, the cruisers of that magnitude could easily intercept that missile. But again, you know, impunity and many other things. So they looters, they are not ready for this quick military reaction. They shoot and they know that nothing will come in response. So you know, they push the button and they launch missiles to Dnipro and other Ukrainian cities. But now the effect because of this will be absolutely incredible, and I think that the war will move to a different phase as soon as the first Ukrainian missile hits Sevastopol Bay. I think psychologically Russians will be panicking. The war goes where it started. Those who take the sword will perish with the sword. Putin's favorite meme is, we can repeat it, and in fact they are repeating, but they don't understand on which side they are. They are repeating the war where fascism lost battles on Ukrainian fields to the army that was supported by American Lend-Lease. But the whole thing was repeated, but they're on the other side. Well, let's continue with Putin. Well, let's try to get under his skin. What he is thinking about. What do you think? I think that we shouldn't be doing these psychological exercises because it's impossible. I suspect that anybody, the most educated person with great aspirations, desire for justice, for 22 years being in power, this person may go crazy. But here, we don't have an intellectual who read such poets as Pasternak and Akhmatova. We have a completely different human material. And just imagine how this human material made this chemical reaction with this absolute power. And again, negative selection, it works everywhere. And all this scum, they kind of started rising. It's like, you know, they were pulled by this magnet. Yes, there are some people there, relatively educated, but nevertheless they became part of this machine. And they never had a lack of those who would push the button. But actually there were those who were corrupting people's mind. They're even more dangerous because they were preparing these generations that are committing all those atrocities in Ukraine. So how do you think Putin will end up? I think it's obvious. He won't die in his own bed, or maybe in his own bed if he's poisoned. I think his life is predetermined, and I think that his cronies will do it when the situation will be critical. I think the probability of this is much higher than other options, because for Putin there is no life beyond this absolute power. This absolute power rests on his aura of invincibility and impunity, and the war in Ukraine will put a cross on this aura. And then there's not going to be anything new in history. It's going to be a collapse of the state, and then they'll find a scapegoat, and it's usually a dictator. And how they're going to do it, I don't know, and it's their business. Obviously, Ukraine will bury Putin first politically and then physically. And the last question, will Ukraine win? It goes without saying. I believe in the future of humanity. And this future today is decided in Ukraine. It's not like Ukraine will win in general. Ukraine will win literally and figuratively. And it's not just a victory over the occupational forces, and the victory that will bring freedom to Ukraine from Lugansk to Sevastopol. This is a victory of the forces of freedom against forces of tyranny. And it will resonate everywhere, in Xinjiang, in Venezuela, in Hong Kong, everywhere. This defeat of the evil will be defeat of the quintessence of evil. And as a result, this victory will resonate in Moscow. Today, Ukraine is saving the world from fascism, from this plague, from fascism of 21st century. That's why this victory will have a historical meaning. And I have no doubt that in history books this will be a turning point in history that our children and grandchildren will be written about, and it will change the vector of development of our civilization. And I think see, the most surreal expectations are completely disavowed by life. Say Orwell or Kafka when they wrote their novels, utopia novels. But imagine that author comes to you with a script and he tells you, so I'm writing this novel, and this novel, you know, there will be a war in Eastern Europe, and already you'll feel kind of weird. But then he says, you know, there will be Jew president will be asking for German tanks to fight Russian aggression. And again, you know, it's just crazy when you see that. And you know, life is much more complex. And I have to say, all episodes of this war, big and small ones, they will become part of the history. It will become folklore. That will be even that will overshadow Lord of the Rings. This is where there is this fight against the evil. I had this TED Talk in Vancouver, and I used to say there that in the book Lord of the Rings there is an idea of absolute evil, but there is no idea of absolute good, because you know all forms of good, they're kind of in conflict all the time, but there is a day when they all unite. And now in Ukraine we have this unity because there is this absolute evil. And they used to call Soviet Union Mordor back then. So now we can see this absolute evil, and now those unite who are in quite difficult relationships, and you couldn't even imagine that such cooperation as between Ukraine and Poland. There are certain things that you can't quite get your head around, but at the same time we see that, and that shows you that we're living through an incredible period where the whole system of coordinates is changed. And the very last question, you know, when we make an analogy with chess, what kind of game is between Ukraine and Russia right now? How you would call this war? It's a very peculiar game, because Ukraine plays chess, because Ukraine plays by the rules, because it plays openly. Putin plays poker, I think, or some other game, card game, because he's bluffing. It's an attempt to cheat, to raise stakes. And in this game, chess will win. Thank you, Garry. Thank you very much. All the best.